probably also get you thinking about how you would want to engage moving forwards with the larger global mental health field, but within that largely more specialist mental health advocacy initiatives. So to start off with, I would like to kind of draw your attention to what we mean by mental health advocacy. What do we exactly want to convey when we say that someone is a mental health advocate or someone does mental health advocacy? Basically, it's a collection of a range of different things that people could be doing, with the focus being on trying to change two things. One is systems and structures around us, and these are not just health systems, but societal structures and systems which lead to barriers in people getting access to good quality, non-stigmatized, effective mental health care, and also in trying to do the same thing with regards to individual level and societal attitudes towards mental health and mental health problems, which lead to, I'm not really sure why this is happening. Give me a second. Okay, this seems to be having its mind of its own. Yeah, and trying to achieve positive mental health outcomes at population levels through these actions. Now, it's important to remember at this stage that what these advocacy actions and mental health advocacy achieves is mainly in terms of raising awareness about mental health issues and mental health problems, and also then going on to ensure that mental health remains on the national agenda of governments. Having said all of that, I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that advocacy does not necessarily lead to changes at individual level clinical outcomes, or rather, there is not enough evidence to connect advocacy actions directly to individual level patient outcomes. But there is strong evidence to show how advocacy can lead to improvements in one, policy, two, legislation or laws that affect mental health, and three, mental health service development. So there's very clear links between advocacy action and improvements in this larger systemic level issues, which then we hope and believe will lead to improvement in health services, that mental health services that people receive, and eventually individual level patient outcomes with regards to their mental health problems. Well, why do we need to have these kind of advocacy actions? Broadly, I mean, across the world with regards to not just mental health and not just health, but related to a range of different issues. Advocacy actions arise out of problems or barriers that people face in getting what might be good services or access to good services. Especially within the health sector, mental health or achieving good mental health faces a lot of barriers, many of which you must have come across in your training, in your work, or if not directly, you must have read about or heard about during your lectures or other interactions that you might have had with a range of mental health professionals and policymakers who work within the larger mental health sphere. So let's kind of reflect a little bit on what are some of these barriers which require policy action, hence require advocacy activities to ensure that this policy action leads to these reduction in these barriers to mental health. The first, and by no means this is a comprehensive list of all of the barriers, but some of the more priority ones that have been identified over the years, which lead to barriers to accessing services. The first one being lack of mental health services. Like a very fundamental barrier to accessing or getting good mental health care is the fact that we don't have enough mental health services. which results in what we call as large treatment gaps for a range of mental health problems. By treatment gap, I mean what proportion of people with mental health problems what proportion of people with mental health problems do not have access to mental health services that should be getting. So generally, broadly across the world, this would vary. But if we look at some of the severe mental disorders like schizophrenia or bipolar affective disorders, the treatment gap is slightly lower as compared to some of the more common mental disorders. And this is for obvious reasons, because severe mental disorders are more visible, they are more disruptive to other people around the person with mental health problems. And so policymakers end up making more services for people with severe mental health problems. And hence the treatment gap for people with severe mental disorders are relatively lower. So for around 50% of people with severe mental health disorders across the world have access to some kind of service. And mind you, I'm not here talking about high quality evidence-based services. Here we are just looking at bare minimum, some kind of service that people come into contact with for their mental health problems. And these treatment gaps then increase as you move down the spectrum to the less severe mental disorders like anxiety disorders, etc. So to give you, and one of the biggest treatment gaps for mental neurological substance use disorders is for substance use disorders. So across the world, if around 100 people have any kind of substance use disorders, approximately around 10 of them will get any access to any kind of service. Even if there are services that exist, the other big barrier is the affordability of these services. Large chunks of populations across the world, and especially in low and middle income countries, do not have enough free or paid by the government services that they can access, which means that in large chunks of low and middle income countries, low income countries, there's a lot of out-of-pocket expenses to access any kind of mental health services. So for example, more than 40% of expenses on mental health services within low income countries come from out-of-pocket for the patient or their family members. For example, in countries like India, out-of-pocket expenses for any kind of health services, and especially mental health services, is one of the biggest reasons for sliding down into poverty or impoverishment. So one, you don't have services. Two, if there are services, they are not affordable. Why does this happen? And one of the big reasons why this happens is because of lack of parity between mental health and physical health. What happens is as it is, governments do not spend enough money on health services. And within that, a disproportionately large amount of money is spent on physical health care, and mental health is treated as an orphan, which means that a very small proportion of the already low health budget is spent on mental health care. All of this results in poor quality of care. All of this results in services which focus purely on treatment of severe mental disorders, primarily in tertiary care services, which means that a large chunk of rehabilitation services, housing for people with mental health problems, employment support for people with mental health problems gets neglected. Societal barriers like stigma then further add to these barriers. And then within the services that exist, the big problem is around paternalistic services, where the views and opinions of people with mental health problems and their family members are not taken into account. All of this on a systemic level has resulted in poor or lack of adequate implementation of any kind of mental health programs, which broadly reflects into around 40% of countries around the world not having any kind of mental health policy, and broadly around 30% of the countries around the world having no mental health programs. And some of these barriers then have led to development of the mental health advocacy programs across the world. And how we look at this historically is basically a lot of the advocacy programs started off with the rights of people with severe mental disorders. Basically, a large chunk of those people with severe mental disorders who had long stay hospital admissions in tertiary care or mental asylums, as they used to be called in many countries in the past. And a lot of the advocacy action was around getting these people out of these hospitals and mental asylums and trying to integrate them within societies and integrate them within communities. And that's how a large number of advocacy activities started across the world. They gradually evolved from various organizations running these advocacy activities into families of people with mental problems getting involved in these advocacy activities. And this started around 30 years ago, which then gradually evolved with people with mental disorders themselves getting involved in what we now call as self-advocacy activities. This was a significant point in the history of mental health advocacy, because this basically demonstrated that people with mental health problems were themselves able to fight for their rights and advocate for their rights. It also led to positive outcomes for people with mental health problems, because it gave them the self-confidence and helped in the recovery process when they realized that they could actually advocate for their own rights and get better services for themselves. Over the last 15 years, this has further evolved into people with less severe mental health problems or the milder spectrum of mental health problems now advocating for themselves. And in more recent times, this has moved on from advocacy, not just for people with mental health problems, but largely into promotion and protection of mental health in the general population to prevent people from developing mental health problems. So there's been a huge evolution of mental health advocacy over the past 30 years. And who has been involved in these advocacy activities? There have been patient groups or consumer groups as they are called. There have been groups of families and friends of people with mental health problems who have been involved in advocacy activities. There have been professional associations and societies that have been involved in advocacy actions. NGOs working in the larger field of mental health, but also other allied fields such as human rights have been involved in advocacy for people with mental health problems. And then other professionals and other people such as artists and journalists, etc., who are interested in mental health of the larger population have got involved in these activities. Some examples of these kind of advocacy groups include the World Federation for Mental Health, Alzheimer's Disease International, World Fellowship for Schizophrenia and Allied Disorders, many of which have an international hub and then spokes or societies operating regionally or nationally across the world. One very recent example of such an advocacy organization is the Movement for Global Mental Health, which started approximately around 12 years ago as a loose network of people from various walks of life were interested in primarily improving the availability, accessibility, and quality of services for people with mental health services and scaling up such services based on scientific evidence and human rights considerations. Over the years, this movement has greatly evolved, and it has involvement from more than 60 countries, thousands of individuals involved in this, and more than 100 organizations across the world who are now a part of the movement for global mental health, which is primarily focused around increasing access to evidence-based care to populations across the world so that we can reduce the treatment gap. So what are the different things that people can do in their own capacities in advocacy actions? So for example, what can people with mental health problems and their families do? This is broadly focused around raising awareness of populations around mental health, contributing to the development of policies and laws around mental health, and a good example of which is India's Mental Health Care Act, which came into action a couple of years ago now, but which was strongly driven by advocacy groups of family members and patients with mental health problems, which has led into probably the world's first human rights informed mental health care act, which is based on principles of equity and human rights of people with mental health problems. Consumers and family members can be involved in developing their own support networks and also developing alternative services to what's provided by the state and policymakers. At a higher level, and a systemic and a societal level, consumers and family groups can advocate through denouncing poor access to and quality of services, violations of rights, and stigmatizing behaviors. But also outside of the mental health systems, they can be involved in denouncing socioeconomic and cultural conditions which have adverse influences on the mental health of population. So this is around prevention of mental health problems and promotion of largely positive mental health. What can NGOs do? This is an example. The picture that you see here is an example of an NGO in India called Anjali, which was started by a survivor of mental health problems, who has then gone on to develop this NGO, which works with policymakers, works through mental hospitals to improve human rights within hospitals and improving mental health care, which is available within government-run hospitals. So this is one example of what NGOs can do for improving mental health. But the other things that they can do is reinforce and complement consumer and family advocacy positions. They can train consumers and family members in mental health issues, but also in taking up leadership roles to advocate for their own rights. They can help and support families and people with mental health problems in starting their own organizations and provide mental health services to patients and families. But coming to the key point, and something that must be of interest to all of you, is what can you as health workers or mental health professionals do to provide advocacy action for people with mental health problems? And yes, you can do several things. Some of these might look very small to you in the larger scheme of things, but the point to remember is all of these little actions that we do then lead to larger change. And hence, anything that we can do as health professionals or mental health professionals can add to the larger mental health advocacy action across the world. So what can we do as health professionals? So the first thing that we can do is start reconfiguring our perspectives so that we look at mental health problems from a consumer and family perspective, from the patients and families' perspective. And this starts off with respecting the rights of patients in our daily clinical work. We have to remember that unlike a lot of other health problems, in mental health problems, we are provided by policymakers and government with some special powers which allow us to take away some of the human rights that people enjoy as citizens of a free country. This does not happen with any other health problem. I mean, you don't see people with diabetes being locked up in a hospital because they refuse to take their insulin. We kind of accept that they have the agency to make the decision, and it might be a silly decision they might be making, but they have the right to make the decision. But that doesn't happen with mental health care. So we have to be respecting the rights of patients in our daily clinical work, thinking around how we take informed consent, thinking around when we develop our management plans around the least restrictive care alternative, rather than locking up people in hospitals because they are unwell or because they are not willing to adhere to the treatment plan that's been developed. Even then, we need to look at the least restrictive care alternative compared to locking people up into mental hospitals. And so the bottom line is we need to be looking at every mental health patient unreservedly, without any reservations, as a free, autonomous citizen of the country who should be informed and consulted about any clinical decision that we are making about them during different stages of the treatment process. This is non-negotiable. This is something that we can do in our daily clinical practices. What can we do in collaboration with consumers and family groups? As health professionals, we generally are not very educated or don't know much about such kind of consumer or patient or family groups. And it's vice versa as well. I mean, some of these consumer and family groups tend to not engage mental health professionals because of the long history of confrontation between mental health professionals and such groups. But what we need to do is change that mindset. We need to understand fully how consumer and family groups function. We need to participate in their activities directly by attending their meetings, but also in terms of providing them support and training and awareness activities so that we empower them to strengthen their advocacy activities. We can support the development of patient and family groups within the health settings that we work with, and this helps to accelerate the development of the larger patient and family movements. We have to consider this as a part of our usual work. And we can do this by fostering social support networks. We can do this by bringing patients and families together into groups. We can do this by encouraging them to form networks. We can do this by providing them with the information that they need to do this. And we can do this by providing them with structural support, such as rooms within the hospitals or other health services to carry on these activities. And finally, at a systemic level, we can help them by involving them in planning of mental health services. We can do this by involving the co-opting members from the societies, networks, and organizations onto local health boards or any other kind of policy initiatives, which will help them to also evaluate and plan mental health services, which are more responsive to the needs and requirements of people with mental health problems. However, having said all of this, I just want to kind of highlight the fact that it's not easy to advocate for the rights of people with mental health problems. There are several barriers at various levels that you will encounter if you do decide to go down this route of mental health advocacy. And these barriers come at various levels. So you're going to get barriers from policymakers, because effectively, when you start advocating for better services or kind of promotion of human rights of people with mental health problems, naturally policymakers or people who provide services start looking at this as a critique of what they are providing. So you are basically now seen as someone who is criticizing the kind of services that the policymakers are providing, and hence they might tend to go on the defensive. So one of the solutions, or one of the ways to overcome this is to actually start speaking a language of evidence, start speaking the language of cost effectiveness, start speaking the language of how improving services and providing better care can lead to cost savings for governments and policymakers. And so you need to configure your language around ones which policymakers can understand and work with them towards goals which are goals that they are trying to achieve, which is in terms of costs and effectiveness. You might get resistance from mental health advocacy groups, because having said what I have said around the large number of mental health advocacy groups across the world, we also have to realize that there's division and friction between these different mental health advocacy groups, because they have different perspectives, various perspectives towards mental health. So some might be taking an anti-position towards mental health services, an anti-psychiatry position towards mental health services, whereas others, like the NGO that I described about from India called Anjali, which tends to work from the inside, which is working with policymakers. And so it's not all hunky-dory in terms of all mental health advocacy groups working together all the time. So again, we need to find positions which are common to these various groups and help them to achieve the common goals that we are trying to achieve. with health workers like yourselves, we also have to understand that it's not going to be easy. When you try to advocate for positions of people with mental health problems, you're going to meet with resistance and antagonism from general health workers as well as mental health workers, because basically, again, what you're trying to say might come across as a critique of the services that are being provided by these health workers. And when this happens, I think, again, you need to find a common language and try to talk about things such as how improvement of mental health services will also help in advocating for the rights of health workers, because improvement of services will also improve the working lives of people who provide care for mental health problems. So finding this kind of common positions is very important so that you can work towards a common goal. And finally, before I end, we have to understand that when it comes to the types and numbers of advocacy groups that are available or functional across different countries, there is going to be huge variations. And what you can do and what you should be doing will vary based on which part of the world you are in. And these actions will then vary based on the number and types of advocacy groups that you have. So for example, when you do not have any advocacy groups within your country, you have to start from scratch. You have to be thinking about setting the foundation for many of these advocacy groups, which involves setting the right priorities for advocacy actions along with the Ministry of Health or the policymakers, drawing up a list of these priority mental health advocacy issues, and then disseminating this across various stakeholders within the country. Try to identify one or two mental health services which are beacons of best practice within the country, and develop a joint demonstration project or a proof of concept project with these. And then try to bring together various stakeholder groups interested in the rights of people and carry out advocacy levels at small scales initially, because this is kind of developing the foundation for a larger action at a later stage. In countries where there are fewer advocacy groups, you would be focusing on empowering those which are already existing, training them with more leadership skills, carrying out an evaluation of the work that they are doing, and helping them to lobby with health authorities, and maybe conducting a small campaign to inform the larger population about the work and the actions of these advocacy groups. The least difficult is if you are in a situation where you have many advocacy groups, and here it's more about bringing these advocacy groups together so that there is joint advocacy action, forming large alliances and coalitions, training them to work with healthcare teams, conducting educational campaigns, and evaluating some of the actions of these advocacy groups. So bottom line, and the key message from all that I've said here is, within the larger global mental health field, mental health advocacy is a highly specialized, but a very, very important part of the work that we do. There are various stakeholders and players and networks which are involved in mental health advocacy across the world, which are trying to improve a range of different things for people with mental health problems. There are various things that a range of different people can do within this larger ecosystem of advocacy. You as health workers and mental health workers have a very distinct and important role to play in these activities. And this might be what you think at this stage are small actions, but as I said, these little actions can eventually lead to a larger change within the bigger ecosystem of advocacy for people with mental health problems. So before I end, a quick picture of my team here in Goa. This is the Addictions Research Group, the group of young people that I work with in Goa. And this is the NGO that I'm based at in Goa. This is the larger NGO which does a lot of other things beyond addictions research. So that's all from me. It's a whistle-stop tour of where mental health advocacy stands within the larger global mental health field and what all of you can do to contribute to it. So with that, I will end my talk. I think the questions are going to happen at the end of the three talks. So thank you very much for a patient hearing. I might have overshot my time by a few minutes. So I apologize about that and hand over back to you, Darian, so that you can take the panel forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Abby. Instead, you're very punctual, and I'm grateful for that. And it is very interesting to hear from your perspective, since you yourself is a clinician. So we can feel that your recommendation is very grounded to the clinical reality we face each day. And what you said, that we need to start speaking the language of the policymakers, such as cost effectiveness, etc., actually gives me the way to introduce you to the next speaker. So please keep your question, or just type it now before you forget it in the Slido. We are going to invite our second speaker here. Her name is Grace Ryan. Hi, Grace. Grace is based in London. She has a background in anthropology before more focusing on mental health. And from the background that I have here now, she's very experienced in engaging with major policymakers in the world arena, such as the United Nations, World Economic Forum, and the World Bank. So I believe we would learn a lot how to speak their language from you, Grace. So please, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much. And thank you, Abby, for giving that amazing background about advocacy and global mental health, and especially from a clinician's perspective. I think that's just so valuable, and really appreciate that you took the time. I'm just gonna need a minute to switch on my PowerPoint, so give me 1 second here. Okay. All right, I hope you're able to see it. Yeah, great. All right, well, great. Thank you again so much for having me today. I'm really pleased that Abby was able to lay some of the groundwork about global mental health advocacy and why this all matters. But I'm aware that many of you who are dialing in today are trainees and others who are at early stages in your career, and this can all feel rather intimidating, like where do I start as a global mental health advocate? And to be honest, I really felt the same way when I started out at the Mental Health Innovation Network a few years back. I was straight out of my master's program. I had no clinical accreditation. I still don't. And I hadn't even started studying for my PhD yet. And suddenly I was expected to speak on a daily basis to funders, to partners at the World Health Organization, to mental health innovators from all over the world who had much more experience than I did. But ultimately, I came to realize that while it doesn't hurt to come at advocacy with years of experience and a doctoral degree, that doesn't guarantee that you're going to be listened to. And learning how to communicate about mental health to key stakeholders is something that we can all benefit from at any career stage, and it can be a great equalizer. The training that I received from the Mental Health Innovation Network allowed me to get my messaging embedded into policy briefs for some of the events that you've already mentioned. And these were high profile events where I, at an early stage in my career, might not really have a seat at the table, but through this policy work and through specifically writing a lot of policy briefs, I was still able to have a voice, and that was quite a privilege and a real eye-opener. So the next 30 minutes, I'd like to give you just a brief overview of the key lessons in communications that I've learned from the Mental Health Innovation Network, and also point out some resources that can help you get started, sort of in hopes that this might help launch your future work in global mental health advocacy. Okay, but first, before we begin, I just want to give a special shout out to any other early career researchers out there who might have been given the advice from well-meaning mentors that their advocacy work just is not as impactful as their research work. I received that same advice, and at times I worried that I was spending just too much time making policy briefs instead of the peer-reviewed journal articles that are essentially the currency of academic promotions. But an experience I had about a year ago convinced me of the opposite, that you know, maybe not in terms of my research career ambitions, but in terms of real world impact, my policy briefs have actually had a lot more traction than some of my journal articles that I've published. I was interviewing a key stakeholder for some field research at the National Institute of Mental Health in Bangladesh. And the interviewee paused the interview to say, you know, I want to give you some background on global mental health and why it matters to my context. And I was like, great, I would love to hear that. I ended up pulling out my own policy brief from the UK Global Ministerial Mental Health Summit that he'd attended, and he started walking me through my own kind of key points and evidence about, you know, why this mattered and deserved more attention in countries like his. And I was just so surprised and pleased, really, because this guy clearly had no idea who I was or what research I'd done in the past, or even that I was an author of this policy brief. But he was using something I'd written to educate others that he was interacting with as a tool to talk about global mental health. And really, that was just one of my proudest professional moments. And I think when you start working in advocacy, you don't always necessarily take ownership of those moments, but you yourself get to know that you've been able to make some small difference in a way that you might not have been able to do if you were just sticking to the path of, you know, what's a classic normal research career or clinical career or whatever career path you're going down. Okay, right, so let's get into it. What did I learn from the Mental Health Innovation Network that helped me to be more effective in my communications? The first point is around evidence. So what evidence matters and what evidence you should be presenting to stakeholders, how to communicate that evidence, and then dissemination. So how to package it nicely and present that communication. And we're gonna start with evidence. Okay, so those of you who already have some training in research might have come across a diagram, something like this, called the hierarchy of evidence. And at the bottom is expert opinion and these so-called, you know, N=1 studies with very small samples. And you move up to different kinds of observational study designs, and then to experimental study designs near the very tip of this pyramid. And at the top are systematic reviews or meta-analyses that synthesize the results of numerous studies. Now, this is a vast oversimplification, but I would suggest that something like a matrix is probably more appropriate than a pyramid to represent how stakeholders are going to appraise the evidence that you present them. The x-axis I have here is credibility, which may be a reflection of the quality or rigor of the research that was conducted. So it might somehow reflect this hierarchy of evidence, but it could also be a reflection on the trust that your stakeholder has in the person or the organization that generated that evidence. So you might see a stakeholder put equal stock in the professional opinion of a colleague they trust as they put in the results of a massive randomized control trial by a complete stranger. The y-axis here is relevant, and I think that's really crucial because Abby already pointed this out, but a stakeholder may look at a very fancy randomized control trial or a number of them and say, oh, that just won't work here in the real world. Or they may recognize that there's very strong evidence why they should do something about mental health, but they just don't feel that it's relevant to their current priorities. And I would say that the golden chalice, again, reflecting what Abby said earlier, the golden chalice, the ideal piece of evidence that you could share with a policymaker would be something like a cost effectiveness study from a real world environment in the country of interest by a local researcher who has a lot of credibility. And you'll see that some of the innovations that get the most attention in global mental health, like the Friendship Bench in Zimbabwe or the Thinking Healthy program in Pakistan, used other aspects of health that matter to policymakers. So like HIV in the case of Friendship Bench, or maternal and child health in the case of the Thinking Healthy program. They use these as an entry point to introduce mental health interventions, to get funding to do research, to demonstrate that those interventions improved outcomes and lowered costs for these other health services. So doing something about mental health improved HIV outcomes, doing something about mental health improved child development. And it's worth mentioning that both the Friendship Bench and Thinking Healthy program trials were run by quite prominent researchers from Zimbabwe and Pakistan, so from the country that the policymakers were also from, and they'd invested years in building up trusting relationships with stakeholders, which really added to their credibility and pushed them, you know, even farther along this matrix. Okay, so this is by no means oh, sorry, I've skipped ahead of myself. What I wanted to also point out is that most of us don't have that kind of golden chalice evidence to fall back on. That's one reason why I wanted to show this as a matrix where, you know, as long as you're avoiding the evidence that is not relevant or credible at all, you know, the shaded in evidence, you can piece together really relevant evidence, really credible evidence to make make an argument to policymakers or other stakeholders to kind of make your case. So for example, perhaps your findings, so maybe as a clinician or an early career researcher, you don't have the resources to carry out gold standard research, you know, the stuff high up on that pyramid, that hierarchy of evidence. But you can establish your credibility in other ways. So for example, perhaps findings from a small study you've done within your own services align really nicely with recommendations of the World Health Organization that, you know, help establish some credibility. Or maybe they are mirrored by high quality studies from nearby countries or findings of an international meta-analysis. So again, don't waste your time trying to synthesize and package evidence for stakeholders that is neither particularly credible nor particularly relevant to them. But do try to employ evidence that is relevant and credible, if not from the same study or studies, then by building a case for your argument through a process of synthesizing evidence from a variety of sources that are either highly relevant or highly credible, and try to build a case that hits on both of those points. Okay, so this is by no means an exhaustive list, but if you're just starting out, I would suggest you get familiar with these 3 resources. The WHO Mind Bank has a searchable database of resources by country. For example, the WHO AIMS reports, which outline the current state of the mental health system in each country, or policy documents that might help you to underscore the relevance of your argument that you're making to any existing commitments in your country. The Lancet produced 3 commissions on global mental health in 2007, 2011, and 2018. And these are good places to go for high-level syntheses of information on key issues in the field. Interestingly, a colleague from a funding agency once told me that her organization put more stock in Lancet commissions than in virtually any other kind of academic publication. So in other words, they're considered highly credible in a way that some other studies just aren't. And finally, search Cochrane and other databases for systematic reviews, because although not all stakeholders will put the same emphasis on that hierarchy of evidence that we showed earlier, it's still more convincing to say that a review of all of the available studies on a particular topic supports your argument rather than just citing some individual studies. It lets them know that, you know, there's a trend when you look at the research quite comprehensively. Great. Okay, so from evidence, let's move on to this point about persuasion. Now, it sounds pretty obvious, but we really have to ensure that we're putting ourselves in our audience's shoes, and this can be hard to do, especially for clinicians and researchers. You spend years of your life learning to say myocardial infarction instead of heart attack, or double-blinded, multi-site, individually randomized control trial instead of trial, and then you basically have to untrain yourself and remember how to speak like a normal person again. And at the same time, you may have to do a lot more learning to also understand your stakeholders, what they know and care about, and how they communicate, and sometimes they're very strange in idiosyncratic language as well, but it must be done. There are also some tricks to keep in mind that can make your communications more effective. Our old communications officer at MHAN used to teach the SUCCESS acronym to us, which means simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional, and stories. I'm going to go through these a little bit quickly so we don't run out of time. The first is simple. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but I would say that writing or communicating in a simple way doesn't just mean using simple language to convey your argument. It also means simplifying your argument. For example, as a general rule, we try to include just 3 key points in a policy brief, and we provide evidence for each. But if we were to give 4 or 5 points, it actually becomes much more difficult for a busy policymaker to follow along and digest all of your key takeaways. I'd also love to tell you a story about decision paralysis and Tesco supermarkets here in the UK if we have time later, but that might have to wait for the Q&A. Okay, this is just a quick example. I believe it's from a Time to Change campaign, and as much as I actually like the text in the second smaller paragraph, the first sentence is very compact, concise, and emotive, and it really tells the reader what they need to take away, you know, so you don't think twice before laughing about somebody's mental illness. Mental illness isn't a joke. You know, you can spend a lot of text kind of explaining that, but readers generally already kind of know it. And so you don't need to spend a lot of time kind of re-emphasizing that point. Okay, moving on to the U of success. This is unexpected. So cultivating surprise and curiosity can actually get a stakeholder to stick with you for longer, even if you do it by saying the opposite of what they expect or what they think they know. So as a general rule, we don't want communications to be confusing, but sometimes by putting something a little bit unexpected or almost just a teeny bit confusing, you actually can really engage somebody who's trying to, engage somebody in trying to understand your reasons for saying it. So this is just an example that I use a lot of times when teaching public health students. You know, we ask which is the biggest drain on the global economy: cancer, mental disorders, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases. And from their previous education, they know the global burden of disease for cardiovascular diseases is so high, or they might have personal experiences of the high costs of care for cancer. And so they inevitably say A or D, they almost never say B. And when we do suddenly realize that the answer to this question is B, it sparks a really interesting conversation about our assumptions about mental health and the ways that it impacts society and some of our unconscious biases. So by doing something a little bit unexpected, we actually engage the folks who are listening to us a bit more. Okay, and then for our first C, this is concrete. This is actually based on the science of memory. Often it's easier to remember things when we associate them with a picture, a smell, or some other sense. This is another example that our communications officer used to give, which was of a nutritionist who realized that there were over 37 grams of saturated fat in the butter flavoring that was being used for popcorn at most movie theaters. Now, for a nutritionist who has a really good grasp of the saturated fat content of different kinds of foods, this is an astonishingly high number. But he was struggling to convey this to the public and to the industry stakeholders who he was hoping to influence. So at a meeting, he set up two tables, one with a standard box of movie theater popcorn and the other piled high with all kinds of familiar junk foods, amounting to a total of 37 grams of saturated fat. So this visual made it real for his stakeholders, and he was successful in advocating for movie theaters to change their recipe to reduce their fat content. Okay, we've already spoken a bit about credibility, and this goes back to Abby's earlier points about speaking the language of cost and cost effectiveness. Within reason, use statistics and provide concrete details that make your communications more credible. But ideally try to frame them in a way that is still simple to understand, keeping that earlier S in mind. You don't want to give so much information that you actually overwhelm your audience. And these last 2 points are a bit more about salesmanship, so how you frame your argument. One is the Sinatra Test. And if you're a Frank Sinatra fan, you might be familiar with a line in one of his songs, which says, "If you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere." I find this a useful way of talking about global mental health because there's so much innovation happening, even and especially in low resource settings. So you might say, oh, if they can do this in Nepal, why not Indonesia? Or if they can do this in Uganda, why not in the UK? And in this way, you can actually sort of leverage evidence and experience from other settings to advocate for change in your own, demonstrating that it's possible. And I love that that sort of links us all together in the project of trying to promote global mental health advocacy. What somebody's doing in one country can have this incredible knock-on effect in other places. The other point we're probably familiar with is basically, you know, let's try this for a week or a month or whatever, and if it doesn't work, we don't have to keep doing it. So it's that try before you buy principle. And this can be a great way to sort of slowly work on a skeptical stakeholder who, you know, doesn't think that something's going to work, but if you can do it on a small scale, maybe that gives you a foothold. All right, and this other one I think is quite obvious, but actually is something that's a little bit untapped in global mental health. I think sometimes in our efforts to make a really scientific, evidence-based argument about why we need to do more in global mental health, we often forget about the emotional side and the fact that you know, our stakeholders are also human beings, that just given that 1 in 4 people have probably experienced a mental health condition at some point in their life, they may have personal experience, or a family member, somebody they care about might. And we don't often engage with stakeholders in that personal emotive level, but sometimes that's enough to make change. And in a lot of countries where you'll see quite drastic improvements in mental health policy or legislation over a short period of time, you'll often look around the government and try and figure out which minister it is who has a child who has, you know, a mental or neurological or substance use condition. And oftentimes you'll find that that's really the motivation that kind of drove change with somebody's personal experience. So we need to remember that people do care about people and not just ideas. Try and associate with things that people already care about. And I think the examples that we gave earlier around Thinking Healthy program focusing on maternal and child health is one example. And another kind of bit of salesmanship is saying, you know, is trying to make people think, do you want to be the kind of person who ignores mental health? You know, do you want to be the kind of person who doesn't take this seriously? And that can be another way of kind of getting at that emotional aspect. And we oftentimes see that in a lot of advertisements for NGOs and things in the humanitarian sector. Okay, and the last one in our success, it's one S short, but the last S is stories. And I think we need to also remember again that we are human beings, so we're stakeholders, and we really interact through storytelling. We, are read bedtime stories from a young age, and we watch TV and movies and read books, and we're primed to follow a story in a way that we're not necessarily always primed just to passively absorb information that's being presented to us. So is there a way that you can communicate through story? There are 3 different plots that are oftentimes talked about in communications. A challenge plot that inspires you by appealing to your perseverance and courage, a connection plot that inspires you to be more like someone you admire, or a creative plot which inspires you to do something different or to experiment. And I really like the next video, which I hope we have time to show, which is called the blood clock, because I think that it actually tries to bring together all 3 of these different types of plot lines. And it's actually about a communications effort done for a particular research trial called the Woman Trial. And it sort of stars an OB-GYN who's working to help women help reduce maternal mortality through blood loss around the world. Anyway, I think I'm going to hand over for a second to one of the organizers to actually play the video, because I'm a little bit technologically incapable on this end. Is that possible, guys?
Yeah.
I might have to unshare my screen for a second. Great. Or another option is I could just keep going and we could look at it at the end if there's time. All right, I'll do that instead. Okay, hopefully we'll have a chance to look at this at the end.
We can do it. Please.
Oh,
Yeah.
great.
And I'm a consultant obstetrician, which means I look after pregnancies where there's difficulty. I get enormously close to the people I look after and form very strong relationships. None of us would be here if having a baby was a flawed process. It works. Women have been having babies for a while now. But we know that it goes wrong sometimes. When I'm thinking about a problem, I've had a bad day at work and someone's died or their baby's died or something tragic, I come home and just bury myself in the complexity of working out the maths for something I'm building is enormous relief. So because of my day job as an obstetrician, because I like to make things, I was asked to come up with a piece of art or some installation, some piece that would graphically illustrate the problems of blood loss in childbirth. So the blood clock is based on a simple idea that it has to graphically show the kind of blood loss that women lose before they bleed to death. So blood trickles over 6 minutes into a cylinder, which then tips into a bath that thousands of babies have spent their first hour in. They were discarded from maternity hospital. And the energy of it tipping back connects through a whole series of gears that move the minute hand on 6 minutes or one more death.
Grace, you're still muted.
Ini ya, ada
I think Grace is still muted. Leslie, could you stop your video?
Grace. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah,
Great, that's a relief.
Crystal clear.
Okay, thank you. All right, so that video I love because it's a great example of all three plots. So the OBGYN here is someone we might admire for his own perseverance and inspire us, but he's also doing something quite creative and different. And something else that I quite like about this is that many of you are psychiatric trainees or other folks who may not necessarily be user survivor advocates yourself. And you might feel, you know, well, I don't have a story to share in the same way that perhaps somebody who's directly affected. But this is, you know, a video that's not necessarily just about the women in the trial who benefited from it. It's a story about the perseverance of somebody who was actually involved in the process of communication. So it's sort of like a meta communication, you know, communicating about the communication. And I think it encouraged us to think about different ways that we can share a story about our work that are not just, or that include different kinds of stakeholders, including ourselves. Great. Okay, so finally, we're going to come to dissemination. And I think there's a couple different steps in coming up with a dissemination plan. So you want to think about the problem that you're trying to tackle. So what exactly is it that you're trying to change? And this seems so obvious, but oftentimes I do see policy briefs where, you know, I don't really understand what exactly it is that somebody wants to do very specifically. They'll talk vaguely about mental health, but they won't say exactly what they need the policymaker to do. So you want to be thinking about who your audience is, who has the power to solve this particular problem, and what exactly you want them to do, and get that across. And if there isn't a specific action that you want them to do, maybe you can just be clear that you want them to educate themselves about this topic and that it's important that they keep it in mind. But always tell your audience what exactly it is that you want from them. Great. So an example of this is with a project called Thinking Healthy Pakistan that I've already mentioned previously. So Thinking Healthy Pakistan was one of a number of innovations who were selected to participate in a satellite session of the World Bank's spring meeting that was held together with the WHO back in 2016. And the goal was to try and get ministers of finance and health to see some of the really good work that was being done in their countries and to advocate for change and for further investment, specifically in common mental health conditions. And so the Mental Health Innovation Network was helping each individual innovator to kind of come up with their own specific strategy to disseminate, or to kind of crystallize and disseminate their messages at this event. So when we were working with this particular project, the problem that was identified was that the Thinking Healthy Pakistan program didn't receive the public sector investment it needed to survive. So the audience was going to be the ministers of health and finance who were attending that meeting. They were the ones they wanted to target. And what they wanted them to do was to increase the budget line for mental health with Thinking Healthy program funds earmarked clearly. So what was the message that they put together? Well, essentially what they wanted to say was that maternal mental health is an urgent public health priority in Pakistan. And that's already good. It tells the reader quite simply what it is that they want to do. But they took it a step further and came up with some creative alternate ways of actually packaging that message. So, you know, they were concrete, or they use statistics to be credible, saying in low-income countries, perinatal depression affects 1 in 5 women. And they also tried to connect the issue to the issue of mental health to other issues that stakeholders really care about. So they also were clear that perinatal depression inhibits infant and child health and development, and they gave some more examples of that in their communications materials. They also wanted to emphasize that the Thinking Healthy program is a cost-effective investment in maternal mental health, and they did a really creative way of kind of expressing what that cost actually is. So for the cost of 2 cups of coffee, you can treat a woman with perinatal depression for a year, and 3 out of 4 women will recover with that treatment. So they were able to really make it very concrete and visceral for the reader. You know, when I'm talking about this much money per person, what am I really talking about? And basically, I'm talking about 2 fancy lattes to change a woman's life for a year, and for 3/4 of these women, that will be a lasting change. So just another example of a way that you can kind of rephrase this more technical language around cost effectiveness to make it more concrete and real. And then when they were figuring out how to package it, they did a variety of different products. So they created a policy brief. They also created a little postcard with one of their key messages and an image that could be handed out almost like a business card at the event instead of the full policy brief that took a lot longer to read. And they had a really excellent pitch with their key messages sorted out so that when ministers came by their booth in this innovation fair area, they were able to provide them with these materials and also give them an elevator pitch. And all of the materials that they actually used to develop that policy brief, to develop that postcard, to develop their pitch are available in the Mental Health Innovation Network Communications Toolkit, which is freely available online on our website on mhinnovation.net. And you all have access to it and can use the exact same template for making a policy brief as the Thinking Healthy project did, and as I've used for a lot of major events. And before that, I would recommend looking at the MHAN Policy Influence Toolkit, which really focuses on how to identify, map out, and target your key stakeholders in order to develop a full communication strategy to really engage them. I think I'm slightly out of time, so oops, we've lost our thing, but I just wanted to say thank you very much. And I hope that you are going to find the materials on the Mental Health Innovation Network useful. There's a lot more there. I believe there's also a narrated presentation by our communications officer, Agnes Becker, where you can receive a little bit more information and training. But I hope this gives you just an initial start as you begin the foray into the world of global mental health advocacy. And I look forward to reading your work.
Thank you. Thank you, Grace, for this excellent presentation. To me, it's like an eye-opener, and there's so many unexpected elements in your presentation. So I would like to consult with you and MHIM network in the future. Thank you very much. Yeah, and for you who just joined, I would remind you that we will have Q&A session after the third speaker. So please submit your question to Slido. In the chat, you have the link there, or you can raise your hand and ask the speakers directly if you would like to. So I would also remind you that by attending this Zoom meeting that you give your consent for the recording. Okay, so I will go to the third speaker. Thank you, Grace. So this session will be conducted in Bahasa Indonesia, since we feel it will help us to be more related with the context. Yeah. So for our international friends, I would like to introduce you my teacher and mentor. Her name is Dr. Hervita Diatri, currently taking the role as Head of Division of Community Rehabilitation and Psychosocial Trauma at Department of Psychiatry, Universitas Indonesia. At the same time, she is also a chairwoman of Quality and Safety Committee at RSCM, the National Referral Hospital in Indonesia. She is a prominent community psychiatrist in our country, and we also know she has worked a lot with mental health stigma issues, the shackles, pasung, and Aceh tsunami disaster psychiatry. So I feel all of us could take the lesson, and this session will be translated through the subtitles by our friend. So don't worry, you can still follow the key points. Okay. Selamat malam, Dokter Vita.
Selamat malam, Mas Erian.
Ya, terima kasih banyak, Dok, sudah bersedia berkenan malam hari ini untuk berbagi bersama kita, Dok.
Oke, terima kasih banyak, Mas Erian.
Ya, monggo, Dok.
Baik. So, good night, everyone. Thank you. For example, thank you very much, Associate Professor Abby and also Grace. Thank you for raising the possibilities that we can start our mental health advocacy start from now, even though all of the participants looks very young, but this is really challenging, and especially from all of your presentation, we can see that advocacy is possible. And allow me to present it in Bahasa, because some of the key issues is related to our situation. But thank you very much, Jerry, and also all the committee who will help me to translate it to you, and so we can try to have a same perspective related to our situation in Indonesia. I also want to congratulate the committee, especially Dr. Ika. This is really such kind of a great honor for me to know that you as a trainee, you started your organization in the very beginning. Because before that, we are very struggling with the situation when we try to develop an Indonesian early psychiatrist. But now you are in a very young age, you can gather friends nationally, and then you can create a trainee organization. So thank you very much to all of the committee as well. So, jadi apa yang saya mau presentasikan berhubungan dengan pengalaman saya ketika menjalani maupun belajar terkait dengan advokasi kesehatan jiwa di Indonesia. Jadi saya pikir bahwa tujuan dari advokasi kesehatan jiwa di Indonesia tentunya tidak akan berbeda dengan apa yang diharapkan di seluruh dunia, yaitu bahwa kita berharap sekali kesehatan jiwa mendapatkan pengenalan atau dikenal, atau setidaknya diketahui bahwa kesehatan jiwa adalah basic core untuk well-being maupun quality of life. Nah, saya akan mencoba mempresentasikan pengalaman saya ketika mempelajari tentang mental health advocacy di dalam kurang lebih 7 outline area ini. Yang sebenarnya ketujuhnya ini adalah kita sering sebut sebagai mental health system. Jadi mulai dari regulasi, lalu kemudian juga sesuatu yang sudah Associate Professor Abby tadi sebutkan tentang consumer and family involvement, financing, service system, human resource, facilities, dan data and information. Data dan information kita tadi sudah mendengar banyak sekali dari Grace bahwa itu sangat penting, namun itu juga menjadi sesuatu tantangan untuk Indonesia. Bila saya mencoba mengumpulkan apa saja regulasi maupun kebijakan yang pernah ada terkait dengan kesehatan jiwa, pada waktu awal pendidikan saya hingga awal saya menjadi seorang psikiater, saya hanya berfokus pada mental health law. Yang kita tahu sendiri di sini terlihat bahwa angkanya hanya 1. Tapi kalau sebenarnya kita mau melihat, dan kalau cuma 1 undang-undang begini, bagaimana caranya kita bisa persuade atau mengajak atau kemudian memengaruhi para policy maker di berbagai macam daerah untuk mengatakan bahwa mental health itu penting, sementara produk legalnya hanya 1. Namun kita lupa bahwa sebenarnya undang-undang kesehatan jiwa kita, undang-undang dasar kita pun mengatakan bahwa kesehatan jiwa itu sebenarnya satu hal yang penting, karena memang orang dengan gangguan jiwa seringkali berada dalam posisi terlantar, atau bisa juga kita sebut sebagai kelompok disabilitas. Sehingga kalau kita kumpulkan, maka sebenarnya ada semenjak 10 tahun terakhir, ada 31 regulasi dan policies yang sebenarnya berhubungan dengan mental health. Namun sekali lagi, kita tidak bisa hanya mengerucutkan pikiran kita pada sektor kesehatan. Setidaknya sektor yang paling dekat dengan kita adalah sosial. Jadi tampaknya layak untuk kita ajak. Nah, kalau kita bicara tentang perkembangan advocacy, terutama di bidang mental health, saya akan sangat tertarik dan mengingat betul apa yang pernah terjadi di tahun 60-an hingga 70-an. Sehingga kita bisa memahami mengapa seorang Profesor Kusumanto Setionegoro diangkat menjadi Bapak Psikiatri Indonesia. Pada waktu itu kiprah beliau sebenarnya dimulai dari menjadi seorang guru juga di Departemen Psikiatri FKUI, lalu kemudian beliau mendapat kepercayaan untuk menjadi seorang direktur di Direktorat Kesehatan Jiwa di Kementerian Kesehatan. Dan dari beliaulah maka muncul istilah modern psychiatric concept. Gitu. Apa yang disebut modern psychiatric concept menurut Profesor Kusumanto pada saat itu adalah adanya layanan kesehatan jiwa yang tersebar di banyak tempat. Fokus beliau memang hospital, gitu. Jadi fokus pengembangan beliau adalah hospital. Pada waktu zaman beliau kita memiliki 40-60 bed di rumah sakit umum. Jadi kurang lebih waktu itu sekitar 11-an general hospital dengan 40-60 bed. Lalu kemudian beliau juga mengembangkan sekitar 22 rumah sakit jiwa yang ada di Indonesia. Di zaman beliau juga kita pertama kalinya mempunyai Undang-Undang Kesehatan Jiwa. Meskipun di tahun 1992 Undang-Undang Kesehatan Jiwa ini withdraw dan kemudian integrate di health law. Jadi tidak bertahan lama. Lalu kemudian beliau pula lah yang mengembangkan untuk pertama kalinya yayasan kesehatan jiwa swasta yang kemudian membangun rumah sakit jiwa swasta di Jakarta. Inilah yang sekarang kita kenal sebagai Dharma Wangsa. Beliau juga lah yang mengembangkan untuk pertama kalinya jurnal psikiatri untuk Indonesia. Dan kalau kita mungkin familiar dengan istilah TPKJM, itu adalah Intersector Coordinating Body yang fokusnya memang di community, jadi tim pembinaan maupun pengarahan terkait kesehatan jiwa masyarakat, dan ini levelnya ada di tingkat provinsi maupun di tingkat kabupaten kota. Beliau juga lah yang mendirikan, so he's a founder of Asian Federation for Psychiatry and Mental Health yang dikembangkan tahun 75. Jadi bisa dibilang bahwa tahun 60 sampai 70 Indonesia itu betul-betul seperti macannya kesehatan jiwa di Asia Tenggara. Jadi itulah sejarah kita dulu, bahwa kita pernah berada di posisi seperti itu dulu. Sekarang kita ada di tahun 2020, data di 2019 terkait dengan TPKJM yang tadi saya sudah sampaikan, ternyata sekitar 50%, baru sekitar 50% provinsi yang memiliki TPKJM. Semenjak beliau menginisiasi itu di tahun 70-an. Nah, kalau kita masuk ke distrik, angkanya jauh lebih kecil. Hanya 10% kabupaten kota yang memiliki TPKJM. Jadi, perjuangan kita masih sangat panjang. Namun, saya tidak terlalu berkecil hati karena memang teman-teman tersebar juga di seluruh area ini. Nah, apakah kita bisa melanjutkan perjuangan Profesor Kusumanto yang pada waktu itu memang berharap sekali bahwa masing-masing provinsi maupun kabupaten kota memiliki TPKJM. Kita kemudian memiliki tokoh kedua, Dr. Nova Rianti Yusuf. Beliau adalah psikiater pertama yang ada di parlemen. Sebenarnya kalau teman-teman mau mengetahui bahwa mengapa Indonesian Mental Health Law kembali lagi kita miliki di tahun 2014, perjuangan untuk mendapatkan ini sebenarnya sudah diawali sejak 2005. Saya mengetahui itu karena saya pada waktu itu masih residen dan saya ikut terlibat di dalam pembuatan academic paper untuk Undang-Undang Kesehatan Jiwa tersebut. Namun tidak mudah memang prosesnya dan memang membutuhkan seseorang yang duduk di dalamnya untuk bisa mencapai hal tersebut. Namun ada banyak sekali konsep-konsep baru dari Indonesian Mental Health Law yang terbit tahun 2014 itu, yaitu bahwa kita meng-acknowledge adanya non-healthcare sektor di dalam layanan kesehatan jiwa kita, termasuk memunculkan residential care yang menyebabkan kita bisa menyediakan long-term care. misalnya untuk pasien-pasien geriatri, untuk pasien-pasien dengan disabilitas berat seperti retardasi mental, dan yang lainnya. Kita juga melihat bahwa di dalam undang-undang ini, aspek hak asasi maupun obligation dari orang dengan masalah kesehatan jiwa muncul. Termasuk kita mulai membicarakan tentang voluntary dan involuntary admission. Yang sebelumnya hal tersebut sama sekali belum pernah dibicarakan, sehingga memang lebih banyak involuntary admission. Demikian juga dengan community participation mulai dibahas, dan criminal provision, termasuk juga aspek kriminal bila melakukan pemasungan, meskipun hal itu memang tidak sederhana. Apa yang kemudian diundang ke kita sebagai seorang profesional di bidang kesehatan jiwa atau di bidang psikiatri? Sebenarnya Undang-Undang Kesehatan Jiwa ini tidak bisa menjalankan tugasnya sendiri. Dia sangat membutuhkan adanya 11 regulasi maupun peraturan pemerintah lainnya yang dikembangkan. Namun hingga saat ini sudah berjalan 6 tahun kita belum berhasil mengeluarkan satu produk. Jadi bagi teman-teman semua yang memang tertarik untuk bekerja di pemerintahan ataupun menjadi konsultan bagi pemerintah, ini adalah peluang yang besar untuk merealisasikan. Tadi Associate Professor Ebi mengangkat tentang consumer and family involvement di dalam mental health advocacy kita. Dan tadi saya sampaikan bahwa apa yang terjadi dan apa yang dilakukan oleh Dr. Nova sebenarnya tidak sendirian. Dr. Nova dibandingkan pengalaman saya semenjak 2005 sampai 2011, yang berbeda adalah pada waktu zamannya Dr. Nova, Consumer and Carers Organization sudah terbentuk di Indonesia. Sehingga mereka mendorong betul kebutuhan akan regulation and policy development. Seperti yang disampaikan oleh Grace, bahwa consumer voices memang adalah satu perangkat yang sebenarnya juga penting karena orang suka cerita. Orang Indonesia love stories. Jadi memang apa yang mereka sampaikan tentu satu hal yang penting. Keterlibatan teman-teman Consumer and Carers Organization dalam stigma campaign sangat banyak. Ini yang masih kita harapkan mereka boleh terlibat dalam service evaluation dalam bentuk yang miniatur. Kita mengundang mereka dalam acara-acara seminar maupun pertemuan ilmiah kita, sehingga mereka bisa menyuarakan apa yang terjadi di layanan kesehatan kita. Meskipun banyak sekali di antara kita para psikiater yang tidak terlalu senang mendengarkan presentasi tersebut, padahal ini adalah kebenaran. Beberapa institusi pendidikan sudah melibatkan mereka dalam professional education, jadi mengundang mereka untuk menjadi narasumber pada waktu proses pendidikan, termasuk juga banyak sekali sekarang yang melibatkan mereka sebagai researchers maupun bersama-sama menerbitkan publication. Seperti yang barangkali teman-teman ketahui, meskipun ini tentunya bisa saja lebih daripada yang tercantum, inilah setidaknya yang saya amati dalam kurang lebih 12 tahun terakhir, beberapa organisasi consumer and carers yang sudah ada di Indonesia dan tersebar di banyak tempat di beberapa provinsi. Dari financing system kita semua tahu bahwa sebelum tahun 2014 kita punya askes, kita punya macam-macam gitu ya, jamkesmas dan sebagainya, termasuk asuransi untuk tenaga kerja. Di tahun 2014 hampir semuanya dimasukkan dalam National Health Coverage dan juga private insurance yang kita semua barangkali sudah ketahui bahwa mereka sangat tidak terlalu menyenangi untuk memberikan layanan bagi penyakit kronik, termasuk penyakit gangguan jiwa yang memang kronik. Nah, namun apa yang sebenarnya para organisasi atau organisasi-organisasi insurance ini butuhkan keterlibatan dari kita? Karena sebenarnya mereka menyusun package-nya atau insurance package-nya itu berdasarkan tipe dari layanannya, termasuk diagnosis. Lalu mereka juga menyusun unit cost-nya berdasarkan clinical guidelines, yang memang sesuai dengan primary, secondary, maupun tertiary level. Dan yang terakhir tentunya mereka juga memperhatikan National Medication Formulary atau formularium obat nasional, yang kita tentunya berharap memberi peluang untuk masuknya obat-obat yang baik dengan efek samping yang sedikit ke dalam formularium kita, sehingga akhirnya bisa diperhitungkan juga untuk layanan di kita. Nah, apa yang kemudian peran kita atau apa yang harusnya kita lakukan? kita tentunya senantiasa harus cukup rajin untuk melakukan kajian terhadap PPK kita, panduan praktek klinis kita, maupun terhadap formularium nasional yang kita miliki, sehingga akan selaras dengan apa yang mereka hitung yang kemudian keluar dalam package yang mereka terbitkan. Demikian juga bahwa kita tidak hanya melulu melihat financial sources yang kita perlukan untuk pengembangan kesehatan jiwa di tempat kita hanya dari JKN saja. Tapi sebenarnya begitu banyak budget-budget pemerintah, tidak menutup kemungkinan ada JKN dan ada jaminan kesehatan daerah. Nah, itu tentunya menjadi satu peluang yang kurang lebih consideration-nya sama dengan yang sudah saya sebutkan sebelumnya untuk jaminan kesehatan nasional. Kita juga memiliki dana desa yang semenjak tahun 2019 diperkenankan untuk digunakan untuk aspek rehabilitasi orang dengan disabilitas termasuk gangguan jiwa. Kita juga belum banyak memanfaatkan corporate social responsibility maupun grant atau donation yang sebenarnya cukup banyak diberikan pada kita, peluangnya. Nah, kalau terkait dengan service system area, memang kita mengetahui bersama bahwa di dalam struktur kementerian kita sendiri, layanan kesehatan di masyarakat dengan layanan di rumah sakit atau di institusi itu dipisahkan. Sehingga kalau kita mau melakukan advokasi dan kemudian kita hanya datang pada salah satu, maka akan tidak cukup untuk memberikan kesadaran bahwa mental health problems juga terjadi di level komunitas. Saat ini pemerintah kita seringkali melihat bahwa mental health problems identik hanya dengan mental disorder. Jadi belum banyak yang mencermati aspek masalah kesehatan jiwa. Sehingga akhirnya memang paket-paket yang ada untuk kurasi dan rehabilitasi. Prevensi nyaris tidak ada pembiayaannya gitu, tidak ada posko untuk kegiatan tersebut. Demikian juga kalau kita bicara tentang mental health service, seringkali hanya dikaitkan dengan mental hospital. Sehingga memang kita merasa bahwa budget untuk mental hospital menguasai bagian besar budget pengembangan kita dan hanya sedikit yang untuk komunitas. Jadi untuk pengembangan layanan di komunitas. Padahal kita semua ketahui bahwa lebih banyak dengan gangguan jiwa yang hidup di komunitas. Demikian juga bahwa kita masih melihat bahwa kesehatan jiwa dipisahkan dari kesehatan secara umum, dalam hal ini kesehatan fisik. Berbeda sekali data yang saya miliki di awal tahun 2000-an, bahwa kita baik untuk severe mental disorder maupun common mental disorder, treatment gap kita masih sekitar 90%. Namun sekarang data menunjukkan bahwa untuk severe mental disorder dalam hal ini schizophrenia, angka treatment gaps kita berada di kisaran 45%. Namun untuk depresi, angkanya masih di atas 90%. Nah, sampai saat ini pun semua policy atau kebijakan maupun rencana strategi pemerintah kita, maupun standar pelayanan minimal pemerintah kita, masih berada di tingkat tatanan untuk gangguan jiwa berat, dalam hal ini schizophrenia. Sementara belum ada banyak program terkait dengan depresi. Meskipun kita tahu bahwa banyak sekali tema-tema Hari Kesehatan Jiwa Dunia yang dasarnya adalah depresi. Belum banyak hal yang kita lakukan terkait human rights maupun ethical violation pada orang dengan gangguan jiwa. Sudah ada undang-undang atau peraturan Menteri Kesehatan yang menunjukkan upaya untuk mengatasi pemasungan. Namun sampai saat ini PMK tersebut masih terus saja menjadi sesuatu yang sifatnya normatif, hanya dokumen regulasi tanpa bentuk implementasi yang nyata. Tetap saja di dalam layanan kesehatan kita, keluarga maupun komunitas masih jarang untuk dilibatkan. Jadi mereka lebih banyak memang sifatnya insidental, kegiatan yang melibatkan mereka. Saya masih belum bisa mendapatkan jumlah psikiater di masing-masing area di Indonesia, tapi sebenarnya dari data ini kita bisa melihat ini yang gambar-gambar rumah ini sebenarnya adalah branch atau Psychiatric Association branch yang ada di Indonesia. Dan untuk dapat membangun satu branch ini, maka minimal 8 orang psikiater yang ada di sana. Jadi bisa saja branch di sini, tapi sebenarnya psikiaternya berasal dari Kalimantan Barat atau Kalimantan Tengah, yang di Kalimantan Timur ini mengcover Kalimantan Utara dan Kalimantan Timur. Sehingga kalau kita bicara tentang 8 orang dengan area sebesar ini tentunya masih sangat kurang. Kita bisa lihat di sini di Jawa sangat padat, dan memang demikian 70% psikiater memang adanya di Jawa. Dan lebih dari 50%-nya ada di Jakarta, termasuk saya. Jadi terlihat sekali bahwa memang distribusi kita tidak banyak. Sehingga sangat wajar kalau kemudian kita mengadvokasi dengan menggunakan MH Gaps yang dikeluarkan oleh WHO untuk training kesehatan jiwa maupun kesehatan secara umum gitu ya, tenaga kesehatan secara umum. Kita mengenal istilah GP+, yaitu GP dengan special training, dengan additional training spesifik untuk mental health. Kita juga memiliki community mental health nurse yang tidak hanya ditujukan untuk melatih perawat, tetapi juga menghasilkan kader-kader kesehatan jiwa sebagai produk dari binaan community mental health nurse. Kita juga sebenarnya sudah mengembangkan human resource plan, terutama untuk psychiatrist, sehingga kita bisa memprediksi bahwa seharusnya dalam 3 tahun dari tahun 2018, jumlah psikiater di Indonesia setidaknya memenuhi rasio yang terkecil, yaitu 1:25.000 populasi. Tentunya ini berdasarkan kolaborasi dengan kolegium, dengan dinas kesehatan maupun rumah sakit. Yang kita harapkan adalah bukan hanya dalam bentuk plan saja, tetapi kita berharap dinas kesehatan, Pemda maupun rumah sakit menyediakan beasiswa untuk teman-teman berangkat belajar sebagai psikiater. Karena kalau berangkat atas keinginan mandiri, proses perizinannya biasanya cukup lama. Didahulukan biasanya untuk 4 besar, seperti yang teman-teman sudah ketahui. Hal lain yang kita usahakan adalah dengan memasukkan advocacy dan leadership, keterampilan tersebut sebagai bagian dari training psychiatric. Namun kita masih melihat bahwa tidak semua 9 center pendidikan yang ada di Indonesia sudah memasukkan advocacy dan leadership di dalam trainingnya. Sehingga memang PR berikutnya adalah bagaimana kalau psychiatric advocacy dan leadership ini boleh masuk dalam training atau workshop yang ada di kegiatan-kegiatan ilmiah kita. Data ini saya ambil memang yang terbaru yang dirilis tahun 2011. Tahun 2019 ini belum terpublish secara jelas gambarannya, tapi kita bisa lihat di sini bahwa jumlah mental hospital belum semuanya dimiliki oleh semua provinsi. Setidaknya ada 8 provinsi yang belum memiliki rumah sakit jiwa. Kalau misalnya kita berpikir tentang undang-undang kesehatan jiwa, undang-undang kesehatan jiwa meminta 1 rumah sakit jiwa di setiap provinsi. Jadi ini artinya PR juga untuk kita ketika kita melihat provinsi kita belum memiliki rumah sakit jiwa, sebenarnya terbuka peluang untuk kita melakukan advokasi berdasarkan undang-undang tersebut. Lalu kemudian kita juga diminta oleh undang-undang untuk seharusnya mempromosikan layanan kesehatan jiwa, baik outpatient maupun inpatient di general hospital. Kita lihat bahwa angkanya masih 4,3%. Tidak banyak berubah di tahun-tahun sebelumnya. Dan puskesmas pun yang memiliki layanan kesehatan jiwa juga masih sedikit. Hal ini tentunya akan bermasalah ketika kita mau merujuk mereka kembali, karena tidak ada yang bisa melanjutkan proses terapinya. Terkait dengan data dan informasi, ini adalah area terakhir untuk advocacy yang bisa kita jadikan acuan. Saat ini mau tidak mau, kalau kita bicara tentang berapa sih sebenarnya atau penyakit gangguan jiwa terbanyak apa sih yang ada di Indonesia, data nasional tidak ada. Yang ada adalah data rumah sakit. Meskipun kurang lebih sama aja. Di semua rumah sakit dinyatakan bahwa skizofrenia adalah nomor 1. Mohon maaf. Tapi tetap saja sebenarnya seharusnya di tingkat nasional kita membutuhkan betul data tersebut. Sehingga kita bisa membayangkan bahwa strategic planning kita seringkali kita susut berdasarkan data yang dirilis oleh WHO. Jadi bukan data nasional kita sendiri. Jadi kalau Abby maupun Grace tadi mengatakan bahwa penelitian menjadi satu hal yang penting, ini pun ada satu hal yang penting, tapi memang kita membutuhkannya nationwide. Mental health sudah dimasukkan dalam riset kesehatan dasar sejak tahun 2007. Namun sebenarnya proporsinya adalah hanya untuk skizofrenia dan common mental disorder, dalam hal ini ansietas dan depresi dijadikan satu. Baru tahun 2017 kita memiliki prevalensi yang khusus untuk gangguan depresi. Kemudian kita juga sudah memiliki burden of disease research yang dirilis tahun 2013. Jadi pada akhirnya Indonesia memiliki DALIS meskipun memang ini seharusnya sudah dilakukan penelitian ulang. Kita saat ini pemerintah kita memiliki mental health research roadmap yang sayangnya belum tentu semua kita mengetahuinya, namun saya akan share ke teman-teman sekalian. Dan Kementerian Kesehatan juga mengumpulkan data research topik apa saja yang biasanya dilakukan oleh universitas-universitas. Ada 5 dari 9 program studi yang terlibat, dan dalam penelitian ini terlihat bahwa sebagian besar berhubungan dengan gangguan jiwa. Jadi ingin tahu tentang berapa banyak gangguan jiwanya, faktor-faktor yang berhubungan. Jadi melulu terkait dengan kelompok gangguan jiwa ini. Demikian juga spesifik groups yang biasanya diteliti masih berkisar antara anak dan remaja, maternal dan geriatri. Lalu kemudian physical comorbidity, pengembangan atau validasi kuesioner, dan kemudian untuk mencoba melihat efektivitas dari sebuah intervensi. Nah, sangat sedikit penelitian yang berhubungan dengan mental health system. Sebagai contoh, bagaimana efek sebuah policy atau efek dari sebuah undang-undang. Efek dari penggunaan IT, termasuk sekarang di masa COVID ini mungkin sangat bagus kalau misalnya kita bisa melihat efektivitas telekonsultasi gitu, di dalam proses pemberian layanan kita. Belum banyak juga research yang mengembangkan tentang penilaian terhadap human resource capacity yang kita miliki. Lebih lagi terbatas isu-isu kesehatan jiwa yang ditujukan pada kelompok-kelompok yang biasanya termarginalisasi, seperti kelompok LGBTI, mereka yang dengan self-harm maupun suicide. Inilah kurang lebih roadmap dari pemerintah kita yang akan diselenggarakan tahun 2019 sampai 2024. Sehingga seperti yang teman-teman bisa lihat di sini, kita juga masih melihat ya bahwa masalah manajemen dalam hal ini terkait dengan mental health system itu masih sangat minimal. Demikian juga ke kelompok-kelompok yang termarginalisasi, dan ini masih akan berlaku di pemerintah kita hingga tahun 2024. Sehingga saya tentunya sangat mendorong atau mengundang teman-teman untuk memiliki motivasi lebih untuk melakukan research di area-area yang belum banyak orang mengembangkannya sebagai suplemen tentunya atau komplement bagi penelitian yang ada di pemerintahan kita. Nah, terakhir saya ingin mau menyampaikan bahwa apa sih yang menjadi masalah mental health advocacy di Indonesia. Yang pertama sangat tergantung pada pimpinan kita pada saat itu, interestnya apa, agendanya apa, plannya apa. Bisa jadi pemimpin yang satu tidak ingin melanjutkan plan yang dimiliki oleh leader sebelumnya gitu, sehingga sangat sulit bila kita tidak memiliki advocacy roadmap atau advocacy strategi yang jangka panjang. Kadang-kadang karena kita baru lulus atau kita masih sangat antusias untuk belajar, terlalu banyak message yang kita bawa, terlalu banyak agenda, dan kalau dibilang priority harusnya satu, juga terlalu banyak priority, sehingga membuat mereka bingung bagaimana sebenarnya menyikapinya. Belum lagi isu di negara kita terkait desentralisasi maupun regional autonomy policy yang sekarang baru saja keluar ya, otonomi daerah. Kita melihat bahwa apa yang dimintakan oleh pusat, jadi kalau kita di Jakarta lalu kemudian advokasi ke pusat dan berhasil, belum tentu hal tersebut berhasil di provinsi dan di kabupaten. Di satu sisi tentunya itu menjadi tantangan yang besar, tapi di sisi lain bisa membuka peluang bahwa kita bisa mengajak atau melakukan advokasi sehingga provinsi, gubernur maupun bupati tertarik untuk melakukan apa yang kita lakukan meskipun pusat belum memiliki arahan terkait hal tersebut. Kita sudah melihat bentuk itu di Aceh dan Jawa Timur sebenarnya. Yang lain adalah kita kayaknya memang harus memperluas seperti yang tadi Ebi contohkan, Ebi maupun Grace contohkan. Grace mencontohkan bahwa tidak melihat lagi kesehatan jiwa itu sebagai sesuatu yang kemudian nanti suicide gitu, dampaknya suicide, dampaknya tidak produktif. Tapi bagaimana kalau kemudian kita hitungkan gitu, produktif itu berapa sih sebenarnya? secara ekonomi kita kehilangan berapa banyak sih? Akibatnya indeks human resource competitiveness kita berapa sih gitu. Jadi mulai mencoba mengkaitkannya ke dalam perspektif yang lain, tidak hanya melulu teori di bidang kesehatan jiwa. Kita memang masih tidak memiliki reliable epidemiological data, jadi sekali lagi akan sangat sulit tentunya untuk membuat planning jangka panjang. Namun di satu sisi ini adalah challenge untuk kita membuat lebih banyak. Saya tertarik dengan penelitian yang levelnya nasional, terkait dengan TBC misalnya atau penyakit kronik lainnya yang sudah dimulai. Mengapa tidak kemudian kita melakukan advokasi untuk hal yang sama? Karena kita tahu bahwa kalau sifatnya nasional, kita akan memiliki kesulitan dalam hal izin, kita juga memiliki keterbatasan untuk menjangkau populasi yang luas, tentu saja kita memiliki keterbatasan sumber daya, baik manusia maupun sumber daya lainnya. Nah, sangat tertarik juga dan sangat ingin sekali bila kita memiliki model seperti Inanet yang melakukan penelitian terkait TBC yang disentralisasi di Kementerian Kesehatan. Sehingga hal ini tentu saja akan mendorong adanya multi-center research yang tidak hanya melibatkan universitas, tapi juga rumah sakit ataupun layanan kesehatan lainnya. Terkait dengan teman-teman muda sekalian, sangat baik sekali bila kita mulai menggunakan sosial media untuk advokasi, dan sifatnya itu konsisten. Mungkin tidak usah selalu setiap saat berganti-ganti topik. Satu fokus, tetapi terus-menerus dan didiseminasikan kepada banyak orang, seperti yang tadi Grace sudah contohkan. Karena inilah tantangannya. Ketika saya merasa 10 tahun belajar untuk menciptakan sistem terkait dengan pembebasan pasung di Indonesia, hingga lahirnya Peraturan Menteri Kesehatan di tahun 2017, ternyata saya baru memahami bahwa perjuangan saya sebenarnya belum selesai. Ternyata perjuangan saya baru dimulai. Dan masalah perjuangan itu adalah masalah diseminasi. Bagaimana membuat orang tahu bahwa Peraturan Menteri Kesehatan tentang pemasungan itu sudah keluar. Dan yang terakhir adalah bagaimana caranya kita menggunakan sosial media untuk evaluasi. Jadi kita bisa melihat dari postingan, dari komen, dari pertanyaan-pertanyaan yang muncul untuk melihat apakah advokasi kita sudah berhasil atau belum gitu. Jadi tidak hanya melulu dengan survei atau bahkan tidak melakukan apapun karena merasa bahwa evaluasi sesuatu yang mahal. Jadi saya mengajak teman-teman sekalian untuk mempertanyakan ini. Apakah kalau kita mau menciptakan sistem kesehatan jiwa yang lebih baik di Indonesia, artinya kita memerlukan lagi Profesor Kusumanto? Yang saya tahu mungkin tidak ada peluang untuk adanya seorang seperti beliau lagi saat ini. Meskipun mungkin sekali itu ada, tapi apakah memang demikian? Bahwa Indonesia bisa menjadi macan kembali gitu untuk kesehatan jiwa di ASEAN, itu karena adanya seorang Prof. Kusumanto. Ataukah saya lebih men-challenge sekitar 1000-an, yang 10%-nya hadir di forum ini, baik Indonesian Early Career Psychiatrist maupun Trainee, yang sebenarnya memiliki pemahaman yang lebih baik terkait dengan kesehatan jiwa, tantangan kesehatan jiwa di Indonesia saat ini, dan juga memiliki solusi yang inovasi untuk mengatasi hal tersebut. Saya rasa bahwa itulah memang ciri khasnya orang muda, kita selalu senang dengan challenge. Thank you very much for your attention. Darian, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vita. Presentasinya yang luar biasa sekali. Data yang begitu akurat dan membukakan perspektif kita ya tentang tantangan, tapi bukan cuma tantangan, kita juga dibukakan tentang peluang. So I feel grateful to have you, Dr. Vita, here. You really brought all the message from all the speakers into our context, our Indonesian context. So now we are getting late, but this is our last session, the Q&A. So I will pass the baton to my partner, Leonardo. So Leo will help us to moderate the Q&A session. And feel free to ask whether you want to ask in Bahasa or in English, directly or via Slido, please. I know you must have a lot of questions. So please, Leo, take over the floor. Thank you.
Okay, good night, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Abhijit, Vita, and Grace, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation tonight. I think we have been so overwhelmed with many good informations and inspirations from what we've learned tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to proceed for the Q&A session tonight. And we have approximately 30 minutes for the session. And I think the committee has shared the Slido link for you to write down your questions. And I think in the last 5 or 10 minutes, I will give chances for the participants to raise your hands. And you can ask directly to the participants about questions that maybe you think that you need to deliver it directly to the participants. So now I'm going to share my screen shortly. Okay, here we go. So now we have approximately 10 questions to ask tonight. So the first one is from Dr. Winston Chuanardi. I think the very first question was addressed to Dr. Hafita, but I think Professor Abby and also Grace, you are very welcome to give some additional comments on these questions. So the question is about whether we in Indonesian setting especially, do we need some specific law to establish or policy brief to establish for anti-stigma against mentally disabled. So far in Indonesia, there is a policy or the regulations, that is the Undang-Undang Nomor 8 2016 about the disabilities, but this regulation is good enough to address the anti-stigma for the mentally disabled patients, or do we have to, address a new or specific law for that kind of issues? So Dr. Hafita, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Leo, for reading the first question. So I guess this is also related to the second question. If we are talking about should we trying to have a new or another law for anti-stigma against mentally disabled, for example, in my opinion, this is really my personal opinion. I guess all of the law that we have now, including mental health law and also the disability protections law, will be enough for us to do or starting the advocacy recently. Because in my opinion, the biggest problem related to all of this product is there is no, or there's still limited access for dissemination of this product. So in my opinion, better for us to disseminate all of this law first, and then try to make it a message more friendly to all of the governments and including all of the people around us, rather than develop another regulation in our country. Because there's always a problem if we make a regulation. There takes many years to develop that, and then and like what I mentioned before, the biggest problem is related to the disseminations of that product. So once again, I more persuade you to trying to make a product, a publication or make a materials for the advocacy to acknowledge or to disseminate the specific aspect of that law for against stigma. That's the things that I really want to say.
Thank you. I think the point is actually the dissemination. I think that's the last thing that you emphasize in your presentation about the regulation is there, but actually the point and the thing is how do we disseminate it and to make it familiar to the population. So maybe Professor, thank you very much, Dr. Hafid, and maybe Professor Abby or Grace, do you have any sharing experiences that you can learn from India as well in the UK? How far can you try to disseminate the existing regulations and turn it to something that we could advocate to give the better provision for anti-stigma, for example, in India as well in the UK?
Sorry, Leonardo, your question was not very clear to me. Your connection, you're kind of breaking in connection. Could you kind of please come again?
Sure. So the questions is about how to, in Indonesia especially, do we need to make a specific law for anti-stigma and in mental disabled? And Dr. Hervita has mentioned that the problem in Indonesia, actually, we need more dissemination to make it, more familiar to the government as well to the society. I want to hear some stories in India, for example. Do you have any specific law for anti-stigma mentally disabled, or do you can share any stories about how you disseminate the existing law to the government to make the kind of law is more familiar to the government and to the stakeholders?
Sure. Shu, I kind of take a slightly different perspective to this, in the sense that I don't really believe that having an anti-stigma law will really work, because stigma is an attitude, and you can't really have a law to change the attitudes. What you need to do is to have a law or articles within existing laws which are against discrimination. And there's a difference. You could continue to have stigmatizing beliefs, let's say, against someone with mental health problems, but still the law prevents you from discriminating against them, because it's very difficult to change people's attitudes and thinking. But even if you can't change them in this lifetime, at least you can have laws that stop you from discriminating against people with mental health problems. And you don't necessarily need to have a separate law. I mean, if you have a mental health act or a mental health care act or mental health law in any shape or form, then this anti-discrimination or anti-stigma, whatever you might, whatever way you might want to frame it, can be a part of that law. And that's probably the way forward, because you can't really keep on having different anti-stigma laws for a range of different conditions or situations where people are discriminated against.
Thank you very much, Professor Abby. And Grace, do you have anything to say, something to add, perhaps?
I think just what I would add, although it's not a law, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities does include people with psychosocial disabilities quite explicitly. So, psychosocial disabilities meaning people with mental, neurological, and substance use conditions that, impact that in interaction with other barriers in society impact their ability to participate on an equal basis with others. And it's really good. I think that a lot more enforcement there needs to be a lot more focus on actually enforcing the UNCRPD, which is what people sort of universally bemoan about it, is that it's not actually being enacted. And I wonder, I don't know enough about the Indonesian context specifically to advise either way, but I wonder whether the same amount of effort towards producing a new bill could actually go towards enforcing international human rights laws, whether that might actually make a bit of a difference. And it focuses very heavily on, as Abby's pointed out, discrimination, because you can't necessarily mandate what people think, but you can legislate or you can enforce you can enforce action to prevent certain discriminatory behaviors.
Yeah. Leo, I want to add more information. So actually, Indonesia has been ratified the CRPD in 2011. And then if you try to read the new document or new regulation in 2006, it's about protection for people with disability. It's quite the same with the CRPD. So we are very happy related to that. But as I mentioned before, that some of the regulation or law need an operational regulation or more practical. So that should be, we also should be provide the decree or more practical regulation. But unfortunately, it won't happen in the last 6 years. So I guess I will bring again the things that you already mentioned, Abby or Grace, to the Ministry of Social Affairs, that we really need the practical regulation to as an additional regulation for the CRPD. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Rita, Prof. Abby, and Grace is very well said. And actually, yeah, we already have this kind of tools already, the existing law and priest. But I think the issues is now how we going to enforce and make people know, and we could make it practical in terms of addressing those kinds of stigmatization as well as discrimination in terms of mental health. So let me proceed to the next questions, which stated here that most of policymakers, stakeholders, where they are also a part of the member of representatives, and especially I think in terms of Indonesian settings, the member of the representatives were elected every 4 or 5 years. And however, whenever they are elected, there will be a new agenda or the new aim in terms of addressing the mental health. So it's quite challenging, and how we could address this kind of challenge in terms of changing and fluctuating political agenda in mental health. I think Dr. Havita could also address these questions first.
Yes, thank you very much, Leo. I guess this is also very important because, like what I mentioned before, related to decentralizations and also the regional autonomy, we really need to think or know about the political agenda from every candidates. So, but the problem is sometimes we need to try to understand more about the agendas and then how the way mental health can implement on it. Usually they try to put a quite broad agendas related with health. And then now we should make a lot of advocacy to talk with them and then try to give an example how the way we can help them to achieve their goals related to the political agenda. So I guess it's also very important to know the better detail of the agenda from every candidate.
So it's better to prepare in advance than before the election. Then I think it's important for us to have higher knowledge about what the programs that would be offered by free representatives or the candidates, so that we can prepare in advance. Thank you very much, Dr. Havita, for very wonderful answers. And maybe Grace or Prof. Abby, do you have anything to add before I proceed to the next question?
Just one quick point is that although politicians or policymakers or ministers or governments might change in most democratic countries every 4-year, 5-year cycle, one of the key cogs in the wheel, which kind of ensure that there is a consistency generally of policy and implementation of policies, bureaucrats. They don't generally change. And so working with bureaucrats and kind of engaging with them on an ongoing basis is very important. And if you have champions within the bureaucracy who kind of understand the message that you're going to put through and are willing to put their neck out for you, that is the thing that will ensure that change happens, even though the government and whatever the political leanings of the government are, if that changes, this engagement will pay dividends in the longer run.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Abby. Grace, do you have anything to add?
Just that while yes, elections and re-election possibilities are good sorts of incentives to change and make promises, we've had mental health on the agenda for numerous elections here in the UK, and it doesn't necessarily lead to the actions that you want. It's good to have it on the agenda, but I think as Abby's pointed out, you need people to actually enforce it. And sometimes that can't be done with a quick campaign promise. Sometimes that requires longer term technical work that somebody in, more of a bureaucratic position, a high up civil servant might actually be able to affect in a way that, a policymaker may or may not, regardless of whether they do stay in power or get to power or not.
Sure. Thank you very much, Grace. So there are two questions that I think I could integrate together. So in your opinion, to all the speakers, I guess, how do you see the importance of integrating mental health care service delivery, for example, into the public services, or as well as how are we going to integrate with the civil societies in the community? Because I think for Indonesia setting, for example, each of the public primary health services, they also have their own agenda as well as the civil societies in the community. So I think it's quite similar with the previous questions again about how are we going to integrate with the programs from the candidate or the member representatives made here in the perspective of for the public health care services as well as the civil societies. How are we going to, to work together with them and to have sort of partnership with them? So maybe, everyone.
Okay, all right, sure. Just a clarification, by PHC, do you mean primary health centers or public health, primary health centers, right? Because in India, PHC is a primary health center.
Yeah. We both, I guess, here there is no, I think, but in...
Yes, there's a primary health center, Prof.
Okay, all right. Right, so, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't kind of make a sweeping statement and say that it's the only way right now. But probably it's based on a lot of the evidence that has been generated over the years. It's probably the most efficient way of doing things, considering the fact that in most countries across the world, even where there is not much of public sector budget going into developing health services, there are at least some amount of existing and functional primary healthcare systems. And considering the fact that a large proportion of people with mental health problems have common mental disorders and have severity of the other mental health problems, which can be dealt with at the primary care level by non-specialists, it does make sense to integrate mental health care within primary health care systems so that you can take care of the large proportions of people with anxiety disorders, somatoform disorders, mild to moderate depressive disorders, hazardous and harmful drinking, etc., which is kind of like the bottom of the pyramid in terms of the proportion of people having those kind of problems. These are the systems which are generally, even in poorly resourced settings, relatively better resourced in countries. So you have the kind of healthcare staff who should be able to provide those kind of services. So partly yes, probably at the moment, based on evidence and availability of health systems, it is probably a good idea to be integrating mental health care into primary health care systems. But obviously it's not the only way right now, because there are always going to be complex cases. There are always going to be comorbidities, etc., which will need to be escalated upwards to secondary care and tertiary care services. But then that is the tip of the pyramid where the bottom needs to be strengthened in terms of primary care services, in terms of mental health care delivery.
Yeah, I think,
Could I add a caveat about that? So there's been some interesting critiques about the integration of mental health into primary health care in low resource settings. There's quite a good paper by Peter Ventvogel about sort of the limitations of the mental health gap action program, particularly for people with severe mental health conditions like psychosis, where a lot of the guidance, a lot of the evidence that we're generating or that we had already generated when MHGAP was produced and we're basing MHGAP on, was mainly for common mental health conditions, was more targeted towards common mental health conditions. And I work in monitoring and evaluation in sub-Saharan African settings, and overwhelmingly we see that when we open a mental health clinic within a primary healthcare center or train a community health nurse to also deliver MHGAP, the majority of their patients end up being people with psychosis or epilepsy, not people with common mental health conditions. So there is sometimes a bit of a disconnect between what we believe the integration of mental health into primary healthcare is going to look like, with people getting primarily with common mental health conditions getting really effective services at that level, and with people with more severe mental health conditions getting referred up the chain. Sometimes that upward referral doesn't happen, and we haven't thought enough about the kinds of supports that we could give at the primary healthcare or community level to make that level of healthcare really work for people with severe mental health conditions. But there are examples where it's been done quite well. So through the PRIME project, which integrated mental health into primary care in 5 different low and middle income countries, and then studied that. At the Ethiopia site, they actually added on a community-based rehabilitation component for people with schizophrenia, and found that seemed to work quite well. And I think there are some RCT results coming out that are showing that. But I guess I would just add that caveat that simply integrating mental health into primary healthcare without adding on additional community and primary care level services for people with conditions that may not be resolved within a short meeting with a primary healthcare professional, I think that's something that we do still need to do. So it's not just integrating, it's also adding on, really.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to make it a little bit narrow. For example, in the Indonesian setting, I think I'm going to refer this question to Dr. Hervita, because Dr. Hervita also shared in her presentation some data about the number of psychiatrists around Indonesia. And I also experienced some of my friends which live in some islands in Sulawesi or Celebes Island. There is no psychiatrist there, and there is some patients that with some symptoms of psychosis, and they're also very helpless and very desperate on how to help these kind of patients. Well, I think the nearest hospital from that island was 8 hours by sailing. And if they take flight only for 45 minutes, which only 3 times flight every week. So, Dr. Hervita, in your opinion, how do you perceive this kind of integration in Indonesia, especially? How big is the importance of having this kind of integration? In addition to the explanation of Grace, do we also need some adds-on that we develop to the primary and public health services, that they could also address the general practitioner as well as the midwives or nurses? We could train to provide some basic care for mental health care services.
So thank you very much, Leo. Like also were already mentioned by Grace, actually we have a lot of gaps related to the capacities of primary healthcare worker to overcome all of the mental health issues in the area. But we also have, like what you mentioned, Leo, that we have also geographic problems. So it's very difficult to achieve a tertiary level or specialist workers in our settings. And then if we are talking about the capacities, we also should recognize that most of the medical students having their training related to mental health in a mental hospital or in a general hospital, with most of the cases it's schizophrenia. But like what Grace mentioned, actually in the community, anxiety and depression is more higher compared to the schizophrenia. So this is also such kind of a gap. And like what I mentioned before as well, that the government's focus is more related to the severe mental disorder rather than common mental disorder. So that's why most of the training, once again, more related to the schizophrenia. So trying to reducing all of these gaps, we try to promote the clinical guidelines. Actually, in primary healthcare clinical guidelines, there's also anxiety and depression as part of it, not just only schizophrenia. And then they need more training about that. We need to develop electronic training rather than our face-to-face training using a mental health gaps. And then, because if we make like a face-to-face training, direct training, it's very using a lot of resources to come to one island or to the provincial level. And then just only very short training, 2 until 3 days, and then they should come back again. And then once again, they forgot all of the trainings materials, because they also should have deliver a lot of kind of health problems, not just only mental health problems. So that's why we're trying to engage our psychiatrists in secondary level to conduct a teleconsultations. So every time when our friends in primary healthcare having a problem, they can contact a psychiatrist in a secondary or tertiary level. And then so they can try to help how to give a better diagnosis and the treatment. The other problems that we have in Indonesia is related to the national formulary. So the types of medication in primary healthcare usually is very limited. And most of the cases is just only a typical medication rather than atypical. And most of the hospital is secondary and tertiary level using a typical atypical medication. So this is really such kind of a gap when the patients come back to the primary healthcare. So the primary healthcare cannot provide that the same medication. So that's trying to make a create an opportunity for relapse. And then once again, they come back again to the hospital. So this is a kind of a cycle. And then I guess this is quite similar the situation before in India. So really want to hear from Professor Abi how to cope, overcome quite the same situation in India. Thank you.
Sure. Just kind of to briefly see, I mean, we don't want to be in a situation where we are going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a lot of evidence and continuing to grow evidence, which shows that a lot of mental health problems across the lifespan can be provided good quality care through primary care health workers, through non-specialist health workers, through lay health workers, through peers, etc. The problem has been in implementation. We've been barking up the wrong tree all this while, including the WHO's MHCAP program, where the issue has been that everyone has been thinking all this while that we go in there, we train people to deliver this intervention, and we get out, and everything will be hunky-dory. Now, the problem is training by itself is practically useless unless you do health system strengthening. And that becomes a major part of the implementation process. And unless we go down the route of health system strengthening, which is once you train them, how do you ensure quality control? How do you supervise the people who are delivering these interventions? How do you have appropriate referral systems in place? How do you ensure that those referrals are happening? How do you ensure a continuous supply of psychotropic medications? Unless all of these health system strengthening activities happen, purely you're focusing your programs on training primary healthcare workers anywhere in the world is not going to work. And I think that's where most of the programs which have relied on training primary healthcare health workers have failed. And we should ensure that we should not conflate failure of training into failure of integration of mental health care into primary healthcare systems. We've just been not doing it properly. And so it's a fault of the implementation rather than the fault of the idea.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. and Prof. Abby, for the very holistic explanation. And so that the community has warned me that we have time due to the time constraints. So I think I have very last questions. And I think I did mention a little bit previously in these questions about the community involvement. I think from the perspective of Victor here, he mentioned about how then we could foster the allyship with religious and community leaders as well as traditional healers. I think that's very applicable in Indonesia setting as well, and I think in India as well. So we have any ideas or shared experiences to foster relationship as well as partnership with those three stakeholders in the perspective of the community. So maybe Grace, maybe you could start, share some experiences from the Africa, perhaps.
Sure. I mean, traditional and spiritual healing is super important in the sub-Saharan African context. Studies show, I think, at least half of people who were first presenting to mental health services have previously sought care from a traditional or spiritual healer. It's super important. I think from my limited experience in this area is working with a program called the Comprehensive Community Mental Health Program, and it's a partnership between the International Development Organization, CBM, the Ministry of Health and Human Services of Benue State in Nigeria, so essentially the government, and also the Methodist Church. And basically they built off of services that the Methodist Church was already offering in a somewhat informal capacity to create an alliance facilitated by an NGO, but between this religious healthcare provider and the government Ministry of Health, and to kind of bring them together to deliver a single model of care that they then spread statewide over a geographical spread larger than some countries. You know, a state in Nigeria, this particular one is the same size as I think the entire country of Burkina Faso. So this alliance, this kind of multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral relationship can achieve really incredible things. And I think that we don't see enough example of those kinds of relationships spoken about. And I think there's probably a lot of potential to do more of that by bringing together formal and informal providers and providers who operate in that kind of murky space in between, in order to provide a more kind of tailored experience of mental health care that doesn't, leave people out. But I think I would defer to to others to speak about the context in India and Indonesia specifically, because I know Nigeria is quite different.
Different continent with different perspectives and cultures. So, Prof. Abi, do you have anything to share about your experience in India as well?
Again, yes. I mean, a lot of people do end up in mental health care services after they have done the rounds of traditional healers and a whole range of other types of health and non-health professionals. A very good example of how how we can kind of create a collaborative space between traditional healers and evidence-based medicine, so to say, in India is a program called Dawa or Dua, which kind of literally translates into medicine and blessings. Dawa is medicines, Dua is blessings, where they have set up a community mental health clinic just outside a dargah, which is a place of worship, in the Sufi place of worship, where a lot of people with mental health problems are brought in and kind of to the traditional healer. With a lot of engagement between the team running this program and the traditional healers, they have managed to kind of have this program, which means basically that when someone comes to a traditional healer, they do whatever traditional healing that they have to do. And at the end of it, they say, there is also this clinic out there, which kind of has a clinician, a doctor or a nurse. If you could go to them and then show them as well, that would be very helpful. And people, because they kind of respect the traditional healer, then go and see the nurse and the doctor who is based at the clinic just outside the. So what ends up happening is that people receive both the traditional healing and the medications or the counseling, whatever it's required. The patient gets better. The traditional healer gets to say that they got better because of the traditional healing that I did. The more evidence-based medicine does not take any credit for anything. It's a win-win situation. Traditional healers are happy, the patient is happy, family members are happy, and we are achieving our goal of reducing the treatment gap. So I think what's important is to ensure that we don't take an confrontational position with traditional healers. It's always good to work with them. What is important is to ensure that with the education that we do of these traditional healers, we try to reduce and eliminate some of the practices which are against human rights, such as chaining and beating, etc., which happens within some of these traditional healing camps, so to say. So that then is the second purpose. Besides allowing for the treatment of individuals, you're also kind of making a larger societal health systems improvement, which reduces the kind of human rights abuses that happen with patients with mental health problems. So it's again a win-win situation.
Very well said, Prof. Abby. So thank you very much for sharing your experiences in India. Dr. Harpita, do you have something to say?
Yes. Yeah, actually, our department, our psychiatric department has had one experience related to help one institution, one shelter. It's a traditional healer, which is quite famous in Indonesia, Galuh Foundation. Just only about 1 hour from Jakarta, the capital city. So when we went there, I'm agree with Professor Abby. We are not coming as an expert. We just coming as someone who want to learn about the system, and then why they're so famous, why a lot of people wants to come to the services rather than to the hospital. And then we learn from them that how the way they treat the people really like people to people feeling the someone's needs rather than. And like in a hospital, doctors, nurses using a uniform, and then it's quite far a relationship among us. So this is really such kind of people treating people. And then the other experience why the families really want to come to the services is because they're more cheaper. They're cheaper rather than in a hospital. No deposit like in a hospital. And also, they think that because of the medication, sometimes the family members looks very weird because of the side effect. But in that shelter, people looks fine as a human. And then they also can put the family member as long as possible. Compared to in the hospital, we have a regulation just only for 21 days. So after that, you should go home. But in that shelter, so you can put all of your family members as long as possible until you pick them up again. So that's the reason. And then when we come and meet all of the officials there, some of the officer is also have a mental illness before. So have a history with mental illness, and then they're getting better in that shelter. Maybe because of anxiety, maybe because of depression, because quite a lot of a diagnosis there. And then so they become an officer there. When we come there, we learn that actually they don't have a good knowledge about mental health and also about health. For example, how the way to assess someone fever, how to assess that someone having a diary. So not just only about mental health. So with that capacity, we come first as a doctor, not as a mental health professionals. We teach them how to treat the people living healthy. So after that, we have a good communication, we have a good relationship, and then we start to make a conversation about what is your challenges while you are look after people with mental illness. They say that the most challenges is related with agitation and violence among the residents there in that shelter. So and then I asked how the way you cope that, because that's also a problem for me. I usually afraid with someone who looks dangerous because of the agitations and violence. So I asked about that. And then they said that actually we don't know how to cope with that. And then, so what do you have for them? So they said about the traditional medication, using a water and then plants or something like that. And then I tried to offer, how about if you already trying to give all of the best that you can, but you cannot cope with that situation, do you want to learn about what should I do in the hospital? So if you want to learn about that, so I try to make them as a caregiver, like what I do with the family of my patients. So that's how the way we try to make a collaboration. But I also have a not successful story about that project, because this is a kind of a continuous improvement. So in our regulation, all of the shelters should be supervised by the primary healthcare. But unfortunately, that's one of my lack of my program. We don't have any chance to improve the knowledge of the primary healthcare. So how they can supervise, like what I did and all of my team do to the shelter. So there's a gap related to the officer and the primary healthcare. Sometimes I feel that the Yayasan Galuh or Galuh Foundation's officers more clever or more capable than the officer in the primary healthcare related to the how to cope with the aggressive behavior, for example. So this is the lesson learned that I give. So not just only about the shelter, but I also try to empower the primary healthcare to supervise and to help them as a partner for the future. Thank you, Leo.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Arvita, Prof. Abby, and Grace. A very wonderful sharing sessions, and I think is actually what the participants expect to get the broad perspectives of applying the mental health. Unfortunately, due to the time constraint, I couldn't entertain all the questions from the participants, but if you still have some burning question that you need to ask and discuss more, you can type down your questions to the emails that have been shared in the chat, the ipta.secretary@gmail.com, so you can write them down, and then we will facilitate to proceed that to the speakers. So for the very last session, I think we still have photo sessions because we need to implement and to document everything as evidence, as what Grace says. So we need evidence. So now I ask every participant to turn their video on, wherever you are. Okay. And since now we have like over 60 participants, so we will need more than like, okay, maybe 4 pages for a screenshot, and I will ask some of my friends to help me capture for the video. So I think everybody is ready now. Okay, let me give some 3 seconds to wait. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, it's quite late. It's actually in some part of Indonesia here, so. Okay, perfect. Okay, so let me start in 3, 2, 1. Keep smile. Okay, hold on. Okay, please wait. Okay. Okay, hold on. Okay, next page. Okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you very much to Grace and Prof. Abby and Dr. Harpita for having us tonight, for sharing your expertise as well as your what you have been implemented in your field. And I hope that through these activities that we could do some follow-ups probably to how to practice the mental health advocacy in our setting. So thank you very much. Have a good evening, have a good afternoon, and see you in the next occasion held by the IPTA.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone.
I think the community needs to take some pictures. Of the community.
Yeah.
Okay.
We will stay.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ervana ini
Ya, silakan dihidupkan videonya.
Ngomong lewat sini, Mas.
Mbak Ilma fotonya.
Thank you banget.
Congratulations. Terima kasih semuanya. Alhamdulillah.
Mbak Ilma lagi tidur kayaknya ya, udah malam.
Udah jam 10:30.
Oke, yuk kita. Dari siapa nih? Dari siapa nih, Mos?
Krishna aja.
Alright.
Kau.
Mbak Ilma.
Nah.
Alhamdulillah.
Oh, iya.
Oh iya.